So good evening, everyone. I'm Yael Gishad. I'm a sustainability coordinator for the city of Boulder. Thanks so much for coming tonight. It's really great to see everyone here. We're really excited for the talk we have ahead of us. I've been working on energy issues with the city for about 8 years, and recently I've been heading up a solar working group, which we're really fortunate to have such an amazing brain trust of people in this community that are engaged about this issue and that are wanting to help us find opportunities to move solar forward within the city of Boulder. It's really been a great conversation so far, and we've had some great ideas generated. And if you're following this conversation, you'll likely see some recommendations and next steps coming out of that group. There's, I think, some folks here still from the solar working group. Just want to raise your hands. We had a great talk earlier with Karl that was a lot fairly technical, and it was right before this. I think some folks have stuck around, so just wanted to acknowledge those folks and thank them for their time and dedication. This is a really interesting time to be part of the solar conversation. There's a conversation happening at the state level in Colorado and also across many states on how solar really should be valued and how utilities are looking at the cost of solar. As part of the Energy of Future initiative that Boulder is leading, the community has really said that it wants more opportunities for local generation of cleaner electricity. And solar is really a cornerstone for our local generation and renewable resource goals in Boulder. Boulder has a lot at stake in terms of the solar industry. We have a really robust business community here, and solar leaders that are helping individuals and businesses gain access to technology related to solar are really contributing to our strong economy, as well as positioning our community to make the types of environmental leaps that a lot of places dream about. So very few people really understand the concerns and opportunities better than our speaker tonight, Karl Rábago. He has more than 20 years of experience in electricity policy and regulation, energy market development, and energy technology development. His perspective is quite deep and broad. We are really honored to have him here tonight with us. He's a nationally recognized electricity industry leader and innovator. He's experienced as a utility executive, leader, and manager. He's been a public utility regulatory commissioner in Texas. He's been a research and development program manager, educator, business builder, federal executive, corporate sustainability leader, consultant, and advocate. Currently, he operates a consulting practice, providing strategic, policy, regulatory, and market development consulting in the clean and innovative energy sectors. He serves as the chair of the board of the Center for Resource Solutions, which is a San Francisco-based non-governmental organization that works to advance voluntary clean energy markets. And he also sits on the board of the Interstate Renewable Energy Council. As you can see, his resume is quite impressive, and I'm not going to go on and on and on, so you actually have time to hear from him tonight. But just wanted to turn it over to him. But just really quickly, one point on logistics. He's going to give a presentation tonight, and when he's done with his talk, we wanted to open it up for questions and answers. And we thought the best way to do that would just, when he's finished, is to have people just kind of line up. There's signs on the floor here, and just ask your questions in that format. And if there's a long line, just ask one question, and then if you want to ask another, we just ask that you get back at the end of the line just to give everybody a chance to be able to ask their questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Karl. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. All right, thank you, guys. Oh, don't applaud. You haven't heard me talk yet. I just realized I made a really big mistake. I thought the second talk was supposed to be the technical one. Just kidding. No, I'm not going to do that to you. Nobody deserves that at this hour, especially on your own time. If I was paying you to be here, maybe that'd be a different question. I really appreciate the chance to do this, and I've been following what Boulder's been doing for a while now. Heather Bailey is a good friend of mine from Austin days, and I think she even actually was on the commission staff or had just left the commission staff when I was a public utility commissioner, and we've known each other for years while she did something really good with her life, and here I am. But the pizza was good, and thank you for your attention. I'm going to walk you through an idea that we birthed when I was at Austin Energy, and I was a vice president for distributed energy services. I'll tell you a little bit about that, about how to think about solar, mostly as a kind of a case study for sort of how a utility can look at it. And I will tell you that while it's technically not impossible for every utility to approach solar the way we did, and in fact, some would argue it's pretty much absolutely essential that they start changing the way they approach things like solar. It is easier with a municipal utility. A lot of things are. A lot of the good things are. A lot of the stuff you want to do is. So without weighing specifically into the debate, I'm encouraged by what you're doing because I think you're opening the door to some really innovative things. So let me start with my favorite joke that was never told. My favorite joke that was never told is that on the way to the moon, Neil Armstrong said, "Gee, I hope the lowest bidder didn't get the contract." He didn't ever tell it, but wouldn't it have been just wonderful if he did? I mean, it's sort of it's like perfect. It captures everything about sort of what it takes to do a big endeavor. And it also captures about how absolutely essential sort of your infrastructure and your environment are when you're hurtling through space in a finite capsule, uncertain exactly of where you're going to go. The point that underlies it is that there's a really big difference between cost and price and value. They're not the same. Sometimes we switch the words around, use them interchangeably, but they're very different. Our failure to, for example, recognize the difference between price and value is, I think, the reason why our nation owes billions of dollars to China and has little left to show for a lot of it. Really low price stuff of really questionable value in some cases. And it's an affliction that particularly hits the utility industry, where utilities are regulated under what's called a cost of service model. They're supposed to charge you for the cost of serving you. And they mostly answer to regulators of one form or another, and they don't have a whole lot of appreciation about what value is. It's not really in their formula. And they don't also, in many cases, understand that the price we pay for things may not reflect all the costs that we bear. This is really, really, really important, because it's not that we need a new national energy policy. Every now and then you'll hear the politicians do this. They'll go, "What's wrong with this country is we don't have an energy policy." We have an energy policy. We've had an energy policy for 100 years in this country, at least. Our energy policy is the cheapest energy no matter what it costs. It was actually a really good policy in the early days. We thought if we had the cheapest energy, we'd outcompete everyone on the cost of manufactured goods and on the cost of our agricultural products, and that would make us global winners in economic battles with other countries. We'd reap the rewards of a cheap energy policy, and we liked it so much we applied it to education and housing and food and healthcare. The problem is that we've learned a few things along the way. That the cheapest solution is not necessarily the least costly. The thing you pay the lowest price for is not necessarily the thing you pay the least cost for. And in this country, around 20 or 30 years ago, when some of us were really getting into this electric utility space, we started talking about least cost energy as a way of breaking out of this paradigm. The bottom line for us is that we can't afford a cheap energy policy anymore, and we certainly can't in the future. So we're going to need a way to start incorporating concepts of value to customers into our appreciation of the resource choices that we have to make if we're going to provide this very essential thing we call electricity today and in the future. So this is a kind of a little bit of an experiment we conducted that's become a little bit more of a big thing, and it's come at a kind of a big time with the discussions that have been going on about solar around the country, and that's what I'm going to walk you through. And if my able-bodied assistant, my beautiful granddaughter Avery, will now push the button, I'll start with the first slide. All right. Another piece of context, drilling down a little bit. We are in the midst of one of the most exciting periods of change in the electric utility industry that we've ever seen, and we don't get them often. This is a big ship, this electric utility business. It's the most capital-intensive business in the world, and it's also the most polluting business in the world. And it doesn't make sudden turns, and it doesn't get into periods of change very often. My experience is every few decades or so. I've outlined what I think here is sort of on the table. Because of the forces of technology, because of our demands for cleaner energy, because of the changing of economies, because of globalization, because of all the things that are happening in and around the utility sphere, these sort of indicators and transition elements are in place. When I talk to utility people, I sometimes remind them, and knowing that they may be a slightly different, politically different crowd, I tell them that sort of from my experience in the military, we learned that when we came out of Vietnam, the Department of Defense was not configured for the conflicts and the issues that the Defense Department would have to deal with in the world around us. And some very, really smart people, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, yeah, really, Colin Powell, Petraeus, these guys started a campaign that is still ongoing at the Pentagon called Transformation, to sort of change the military establishment to meet the challenges more effectively. And it was pretty profound given how dang big the defense establishment is. Well, take the utility industry and imagine that same thing. And that's why I like using the word transformation, and I think it's why the word is stuck. In transforming the utility industry, these are the changes we're going to have to make. We're going to have to change from ratepayers, just, hey, you, send in your check. The electricity will keep flowing. Send in your check. To empowered customers. How can we do business together? What do you have to offer me? I'd like to tap into that. How do we reach a fair exchange? From the dumb one-way electron flow system, big power plant, down to small use, to something that could be as much as 3 ways in terms of dynamic interactions. The utility to the customer back to the utility, and even customers to customers sort of managed or facilitated by the utility. Just sort of an example, right? You know, I'm away from the house today. I'm up here in Boulder, not using any particular amount of electricity. If the neighbors are having a party, I'll sell you my excess ability, or my excess, maybe if I had a solar panel, excess generation from my solar panel, or maybe some of the excess juice from my Volt because I'm not planning to go anywhere. And you could buy it from me at a price, and if you pay me a little less than the utility would charge, maybe you can work a deal, and the utility says, here's the price, and the deal happens, and everybody gets off with a little bit of savings. All enabled by things like smart grid technologies and shepherded through by utilities acting in the interest to sort of drive down costs and increase value. From a throughput model, the utility business model is sometimes called the spin the meter model, right? The faster they spin it, the more money they make. And the more they can get you to spin the meter, the better. And in that model, their wealth equals how many assets. It's the ultimate atoms equals wealth idea. And if you extend it all the way to the ridiculous extreme, you have a nuclear power plant, right? 12 feet of concrete. Every atom equals value to the utility. Every atom equals wealth. That's what that model did, and the focus is on gaining more of those assets and selling more of the commodity to keep the demand for the assets going, to keep the commodity going, et cetera, et cetera. We're talking about changing to something where there's an integrated services kind of model, where utilities are saying, how happy am I making you, and how can I make you happier? How can I get into a situation where no matter what you pay, you feel like you're getting more from it than you're paying? That's value, right? A very different kind of relationship for a utility. Maybe we'll have to change the name to have with customers. A requirement to take energy. This is a quote from a utility just 3 weeks ago. A requirement to take energy. If we end the requirement for customers to take energy, we'll end the utility business. Just one that says the customers are entitled to manage and self-generate as a matter of just basic rights. From customer control as a threat, which is how many utilities are perceiving it today, to one in which customers actually participate in enhancing a revenue center for the utility. And imagine how good that would be if the utility shareholders were its owners, if you were a municipal utility. So I sum it up in sort of asking the question, if you have dreams for the future of what utility service looks like, and if you have to be a nerd enough like me to do that, but most of us have dreams for what the future is like at the very least. The question to ask is, does your utility allow you to realize those dreams? Is it a dream of, you know, your kids not having to deal with pollution, or your grandkids not having to deal with pollution, or dealing with less pollution? Is it lots of local jobs as opposed to exported jobs? Is it local control versus control from Wall Street? Whatever it is, the question you have to ask yourself when you embrace these issues is, does the structure now, does the condition now, and its reasonable extrapolation allow you to realize those dreams, or do you need to move for a change? That's what's on the table. All right, Avery, what's next? So Immediately prior to this, on the long list of jobs in my peripatetic past, was a few years at Austin Energy, where I got to serve as the Vice President of Distributed Energy Services. I can't explain that to many people in the utility sector because I never met another one. In fact, it was so weird that they changed the name after I left. Now they call it something like Customer Energy Services. It makes it sound more conventional. But I did everything that touched the customers except for delivering the kilowatt hours and sending them the bills. I lived on the customer side of the meter, helping them with energy efficiency and electric vehicle chargers and solar on their rooftops and their building code and green building initiatives and a whole bunch of stuff. And I did that with the large and the small customers as well. And I took the data and I analyzed it and I tried to develop services and products for customers, again, on their side of the meter. It was a lot of fun. And as a result, I got to do things like run a world-class energy efficiency program. And no matter what we say about solar, your first priority has to be efficiency. Because I promise you, you're not as efficient as you can be. It's cheaper than all your other options, and it lays the table. It sets the table for everything you want to do. Austin's 25-year significant efforts at energy efficiency mean that the average residential bill in Austin is 23% lower than the average residential bill in Texas. Okay? That's what 25 years of concerted effort on energy efficiency can get you. When Austin Energy wanted smart meters, we paid cash for them. When we needed a new power plant, we paid cash for it. When we wanted to do solar, we paid cash for it. Okay? Because we were saving so much money not investing in nuclear power or new coal plants or whatever through our energy efficiency that we could do that. And we had a business model as a municipal utility that we were going to eliminate growth in the residential and commercial sectors. We were going to keep them flat. We were not going to be addicted to the spin the meter model. We were going to keep all those customers happy. And given that Austin is such a vibrant and growing community, the only way we could do that is increase the efficiency of their use, and it was a win-win for everyone. So efficiency has to come first. It also meant, and more about this in a second, it meant that we went 18 years between base rate cases. It's a long time. I was a public utility commissioner when the last rate case came through. 18 years later, they finally had to have another one. We were also a utility who looked around us and said, gee, we're a landlocked utility, sound familiar? With certain geographical boundaries. There are no wind turbines going up into our city. There's not enough trees to cut down, nor would they let us. Trees are kind of a holy object in Austin. For good reason. We have some beautiful trees. And we don't make enough garbage, especially the darn recycling campaigns and all that stuff, to really make waste to energy work. And besides that, you know, where do you put a waste to energy facility? So we only had two resources, the energy efficiency that I just described and the sun that shined on us. We made a decision that we were going to grow our solar because solar was our energy generation resource. And we made a commitment to that at the highest levels of the city from the mayor on down. Went way back in time, but most strongly put in place with the 2007 Austin Climate Protection Plan. And finally, we tried to take a systems perspective. We looked at how things interacted, how one thing connected to another, and tried not to get caught in the trap of dealing with things in isolation. So in the end, we had a pretty successful program going, and I had a pretty successful opportunity at Austin Energy. I will tell you that when the stimulus money came out from the federal government, I was able to get $35 million in grants in 1 year. And during the recession, when new customers in the Austin area slowed down to a trickle of only 1,500 per month, really slow for Austin. Yeah. We, having $35 million of extra money meant a lot to our city budget. And we got that money because we were a good bet for federal funds. Those funds paid for our electric vehicle charging network. They paid for me to run the only low-income weatherization program run by a utility in the United States. They paid for me to increase the efficiency of municipal buildings, to put solar on schools, and a bunch of other places as well. So I often told my people, leadership is required, but it's really rewarded. And when you're going applying for the grant and the opportunities, there they are. All right, next slide. Since leaving Austin, I found myself in the middle of this, some people call it a war on solar. I think that's probably the wrong phrase. I think that does discredit to the people who actually have gone and fought and sacrificed in real wars for just causes. But you know, if you see 5 minutes of Fox News, you know there's always a war on something going on. And it's because they make everything a conflict. I think in order to get anybody's attention, now they have to raise it to a war. Pretty soon it's going to be, interstellar, sort of end of civilization battles. That'll be the real stories. The interstellar attack on whatever, name your cause. But there is something going on, okay? You can't deny the facts. I mean, the utility industry is reacting to what's been seen as a recent growth in rooftop solar, in particular, with a vehemence that is all out of proportion to the amount of this stuff that's out there. It's just not justified under any rational calculation. And I think it's because, I don't know, I've gone through a list of reasons why, but part of it is that they see it coming, perhaps. They see this lack of control coming. They think that one thing will lead to another, and pretty soon the model will break, and then what will they do? And maybe, since it's been happening so fast, so recently, that maybe they're starting to fear the slippery slope, which is another feature of Fox News, of course, and exponential growth rates. And like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? But nonetheless, it has been an issue. And as a result of that, just in the last 2 years, I've been in formal regulatory proceedings in Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, all those states up there. And we wrote a law in Minnesota, and we got that passed, and we got something going there. I've been on the web and in seminars. And that's just me. I mean, there's legions more people doing this. I don't see Megan at half the things I go to, so I know she's doing twice as much, and she doesn't see me at half. I mean, just between the two of us, the number of places we have to be to tell this story and to get these issues straight is unbelievable. And multiply us by hundreds, because people are involved at every level in trying to deal with this. And that's a good thing, because of the reaction to the utility sort of, the EEI sort of songbook has got to be just as loud and just as much in tune. And I've had a chance to work with Santa Fe on the early stages of their municipalization effort. All you guys do is lesson for us. Thank you. And Virginia, have had a chance to work with RMI too. And that's great, since I once worked at RMI. They're a good bunch of people, and they're a national treasure of Boulder, so you always treat them right. And if you want more information about what's up there, the detail stuff is on the website. All right, Avery, let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about valuing solar, but right up front, before we get into it too much, I want to tell you that I see 5 S's. There's 5 things, categories of things that are really exciting at what the RMI has named, and I think all of us call the distribution edge of the utility business. And I just, as a mnemonic device, have called them these 5 S's. It's solar, of course, but it's also storage, stationary and otherwise, and it's smarts, all this information technology enabled stuff, and security, making sure the electricity is there when we want it and we're not afraid of losing it, and savings, things like simple energy efficiency and more complicated demand response, and the kinds of transactions I described earlier. So everything I'm saying about what we're doing in solar, shame on us if we don't learn from this and apply it immediately to these other areas, because otherwise we're just going to have to repeat this, and I'll be back here in 4 years and we'll be talking about value of storage, and I go, wait a minute, I think I heard. So learn it, understand it now, and understand that we're trying to deal with valuing and creating rates and utility structures about all these things that are here. And by the way, the technical talk is combining any of these, right? Solar plus your electric vehicle, plus demand response programs from the utility, plus, and just it gets pretty wild pretty fast. We're not going to go there. Next slide. So when we had that rate case after some 18 years of interregnum, when there was no rate case, although we had been raising fuel prices, because you always pass through fuel prices, think about that when you think about your utility structure. I had, what we had, about 1,000, 1,500 solar systems in the city. Not too many, but more than a lot. We were starting to get the rumblings that, hey, how come all the solar systems are in West Austin, where the rich white people live, and not so many of them in East Austin, where the people of color of lower income live? And why do you offer net metering when they don't offer that in the rest of the state that's controlled by Governor Perry's appointees to the Public Utility Commission? And what is this subsidy? You're paying rebates all the time. You're always going back and getting more rebates. And customers are getting them, and they're big rebates, and they really help them pay for their solar systems. And we were starting to get a little of that noise. And I can tell you within the utility, we couldn't really see it from a technical point of view, but we were starting to wonder, what happens if all our customers get solar? I mean, we know we want it. We used to say it was our dream and our nightmare. We want more solar. We want more solar. If we get too much of this stuff, can we pay for the grid? Will we have to shift the costs in one direction or another? We were very far from it, even with all our progressive past. But we could start talking about it. And I said, well, if I'm going to do a rate case for the first time in 18 years, I'm going to think about solar as if we've never done anything before. We had net metering, and it had worked very well, but maybe there was a new way to do things. So we started with what should it do? And these were principles that I can find are easy to repeat to this day. I mean, if one customer gets solar and one customer doesn't, there should be fairness between them. We shouldn't be perpetuating an improper discrimination against one or the other, and an improper transfer from one or the other. We should compensate a customer who puts in solar because they're bringing a resource to the mix that is very valuable to us, but it should be fair, not excessive. The third one is a kind of a complicated thing, but it's worth bearing in mind just for a moment. If most utilities don't compensate solar customers fairly, they give them less for their solar than it's worth. Even utilities that allow the meter to spin backwards under net metering, according to the analysis we had done and has been done in a lot of places, are giving their customer less than the solar is worth. So the status quo under net metering today is that solar customers are subsidizing everybody else. But they're going to get less for their solar than it's worth. It's a premium product, and giving them just average retail gives them less than it's worth. And customers who get less than it's worth for something tend to demand additional compensation. And what we found in Austin was because our net metering compensated our customers so poorly, our rebates had to be higher. And that made our rebates really messy. If the rebate money ran out, the market died, because nobody will do a deal when they're being undercompensated. If they're just being fairly compensated, you might still have some problems. But compensation is about fairness and what you give me. Incentives are about curing market failures. Like, well, maybe you don't trust solar and you need a little bit of a oomph to understand it. Or, you weren't thinking of buying a GM Suburban, but we've taken $1,000 off. So we'll give you a rebate, buy it. We use incentives to cure for market failures, but we're not supposed to use them for compensation. And we found that one of the inimical impacts of the way we were doing things is by undercompensating them, we were driving demand for incentives. And I will tell you, I wanted to get out of the incentive business because it was attracting a lot of heat. Like I said, I wanted solar to be so successful in Austin, such a vital and vibrant solar ecosystem, that I didn't have to pay incentives to hardly anyone. That it would just be happening and everybody would be paying a fair price and getting what they thought it was worth. So I wanted to manage those incentives, and I couldn't manage those incentives very effectively as long as they still had to pay some of the compensation that wasn't being fairly paid. Okay? And that was critical. I also had a problem that metering has a tendency to encourage customers to use more electricity during the daytime. And that we were measuring by surveying our customers and surveying other customers in other places, and also just looking at doing bill analysis with customers. What happens is we get this weird idea that all our electricity is free, so we let the air conditioner be set a little bit lower, and remember, a place like Austin, summer peaking, air conditioner driven city. And customers just think it's free, so they sort of don't care where they put their loads. We even had evidence that customers were doing things like saying, well, I don't get much for my solar at night, so I'm going to run the dishwasher during the daytime, which is exactly opposite of what we wanted. We wanted them to have that solar running and not much use at their house so we could get some of that good solar electricity to help keep the grid up. And instead it was going exactly the opposite direction. And you do remember me talking about how much we liked energy efficiency. Well, if our solar was working at odds with our energy efficiency, that wasn't a good thing. That was a cognitive dissonance we had to resolve. And then finally, we had to come up with something that people could understand, that would work. So next slide. I throw this in here not to go through any of this except to say that there's a lot of history for getting to the right value for clean energy. We've been doing this a lot longer. Even if you've never heard the phrase value of solar used like I'm using it, you actually have seen antecedents to this with things like the wind source program and discussions about externalities that we've been having for decades about electric utility and other corporate behaviors. So there's a lot of precedent to this. We're not writing on a completely clean slate. And the good news is we don't have to come up with something brand new. We have a lot of tools. By the way, these slides are going to be available to everybody, so we could dive in as much of them as you want to, and you can always ask me or other people about them. But I wanted to make this point just very clearly. We didn't just come up with this. There's a second part of this point that I want to make that's also important. When we at Austin Energy developed this value of solar rate, we came up with this new idea. A lot of people think like, well, I didn't hear about it yesterday. I heard about it today, so you must have just come up with it one day. I got to tell you, I have never had such a miserable, joyful experience in my life. I think we spent over a year just getting it through the hierarchy of the utility to try to develop this new idea. That's how resistant to change utilities are. I joke that I think we could have bought into a nuclear power plant faster than we could have changed our solar rate. And that's probably not a joke, given how utilities dive into those nuclear power plant investments. So there's history there. The history can be your friend, but it can also be your enemy. Next slide. All right. So what did we want to do? Well, we wanted to use analysis to support our rates for solar. Duh. We wanted to say that when we set up a relationship with our customer who has solar, it's going to be based on analysis, not just tradition or history, or even if we could improve on rough justice, that would be good. And we had principles that are supposed to be applying to everything. But here's what it all came down to in the last bullet. What it came down to, there's a point at which the utility, especially the municipal utility, should be indifferent as to whether it goes out, makes a kilowatt hour of energy, transmits it, delivers it, and gets it to your toaster, or whether you do the same thing from your roof. And economically, those two things meet at what we call an indifference price. It's a core principle of utility rate making. It's embedded in ideas like avoided cost, which is used for qualifying facilities under the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act. But when you're sitting there as the utility, and I got to make Phil happy and make his toast brown, and Phil has the audacity to demand that his toast be made brown with clean solar or solar equivalent energy, I run back and I go, okay, I say I burn some coal, and I'll transmit it to some transmission lines, and I'll move it down the distribution line, I'll move it through the meter, and then I'll get it into Phil's toaster. And that'll cost me, Phil, X cents. Or Phil can do it himself. And at some point, for the same number, we're indifferent. And that's what we wanted to do. We analyzed, what's that number? Geez, Phil, if I can give you credit for anything less than, calculate it all up, 12.5 cents, I win. Make your own dang electricity. Toast your own toast. That's fine. We got all the work done. The toast is just as brown. I gave him a credit that offsets all those costs I avoided. Fair deal. That's what we're trying to do. And that's how the utility, especially a municipal utility, should face those issues. If you can do it, and I can induce you to do it cheaper than I can do it, square deal. By the way, that's the same view the customer should have. Right? If the utility can do it for me cheaper than I can do it for myself, I should let my utility do it for me. Now, value gets in there, right? What's it worth to me? Phil may be a stickler for doing things himself. He probably has a really good toolkit, and he works on his own car, used to change his oil when he was allowed to do that, and he likes the idea of having a solar panel on his roof. Okay, there's a value component for that to him, but I don't have to pay for that. Phil actually pays for that because he goes out and negotiates his own price for his solar system. He carries the insurance. He takes the risk that he'll make penetrations that leak in his roof, and that if he doesn't maintain the system, he won't get compensated. Phil's willing to pick up all that burden. And when he does that, that's okay because I don't have to go borrow money from a bank. Again, square deal, value to value, okay? So that's what we wanted to try to do, was figure out where that indifference price was, where my stack of costs met his stack of value, and we could have a fair deal. Next slide. So what we wanted to do and what we had been doing were slightly different. With net metering, which is, by the way, I love net metering. It's in place in more than 40 states because it works. It turns out that if you've done a few hundred rate cases like I have, that the value you get from retail is pretty good. It's a little light, but it's pretty good. It's a pretty fair transaction, and where they give you credit for your excess production at that value, it's pretty good. A little light, but pretty good. Some places give you a lot less for excess production, though, and it gets pretty bad. And some places, like I've heard in Colorado, they want to give you less than retail for both. That's really bad, right? But it's a good program. It's easy to understand. It's been in place for years. Businesses have organized around it. Customers understand it. It's a wonderful thing. But there are some issues. And I'm going to go through these issues not to throw it out, but to say that there's room for improvement. The first thing is, this is the formula. Generally speaking, if it offsets consumption, the value is your retail rate. And then if it's excess, there's something else for it. Okay? So like in Austin, it dropped all the way down to your avoided fuel cost. So if your retail rate was 10 cents, but you made 1 extra kilowatt hour that day, that extra kilowatt hour was only worth 3 cents. And that's the way it is in a lot of states. Now, by the way, that same kilowatt hour, if sent to Phil's house, would make his toast just as brown. But it's worth 3 cents under net metering because it's excess to me rather than the 10 cents in offsetting my retail rate. A little bit of history here, by the way, just in case you don't quite get this or didn't know this, and because geeks like me wallow in this. Net metering actually comes from what physically we used to do. You remember those meters with the metal discs that spin round and round and round? Well, they actually have, or the default setting for them was there was a screw in them that kept them from spinning backwards. And there were weird things people did on their own properties and stuff like that that sort of made that a concern to the utilities. They didn't want backfeeding of any kind. So there was a screw. And when you applied for and successfully obtained net metering, the guy would come out and unscrew the screw and allow the disc to go some forward, some backwards, some forward, some backwards, pull, pull, tug, pull, whatever. The net result, why they call it net metering, was the net forward progress on your bill. And in the old days, by the way, you wouldn't get any credit for reduced consumption. It was just net forward progress or nothing. Then we started able to measure it going backwards and all that sort of stuff. But it's still netting. This causes huge problems for utilities. I'm going to explain in a minute. But that's all it was. Net forward against net backward progress of the disk. That's what net metering was. Okay? So go to the next slide. And we're going to talk about some problems that sort of associated with dear old net metering, which, again, I'm a big fan of, but this stuff comes with it. The first thing that comes with it is it's highly associated with PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act of 1978. Jimmy Carter was president. What else do I need to say? You know, it was terrible. It was all horrible. You know, what happened was, believe me, there are many conversations where that ends the deal. What happened was that utilities were ignoring extremely valuable electric generation that was coming from places like the Ship Channel in Houston, co-generated electricity that was being made as a byproduct of steam for chemical plants and things like that. And the utilities were snubbing their nose at that electricity, saying, I don't give a flip how cheap it is, I don't want it. Nobody's going to make me buy this stuff. They were really paranoid about that. They didn't want to buy other people's electricity because every time they bought other people's electricity, they reduced their need for those big power plants they wanted to build. And remember, the big power plants make them the money. So Congress just finally got fed up in one of those rare moments of action and said, damn it, you're going to have to buy electricity. And they created this avoided cost structure, and associated with that is net metering. So in the old utility mindset, it's part of being forced to do something. And it explains a little bit of the vitriol that we see today. It's a legacy of, damn it, they told us what we have to do. Okay? It also is true that none of net metering's value that it assigns to solar is backed by analysis in most places. It just says, if you spin the meter back 1 full turn, you get 1 full credit. We don't know if it's worth that. Remember, utilities don't do a lot of valuation. So we don't know if it's actually worth that. We're just going to give it to you. which is a major point of attack for many utilities today, that there's no analysis behind the retail value for net metering. Analysis tends to show that it's worth a lot more, but utilities don't have time for that analysis. They just say there's no analysis for net metering and therefore it's worth nothing. They say it creates an accounting under recovery, and it does. What happens is, first of all, if they didn't plan on you installing that solar, they're not selling you as much electricity as they plan to, and that's a problem between rate cases. But also, because all of the forward progress of the disk could be offset by the backward progress of your generation, the accountants never actually see the book value of your consumption. It's there, it's real, but it got overwhelmed by your solar system operating so well. And so they say, well, then I never collected any money. And they didn't. They charge you for it, but then it got offset by the charge, by the generation credit. So it just created this accounting problem where the accountants were going, his bill's down to zero. I'm not getting anything from him. Dang it, it's a shortfall. It also, where we have this step down where the payment for the excess is low, I told you it encourages consumption during periods of peak production, because if you're making excess at 4 p.m., then you're an idiot, right? Because if you just turn on your hairdryer, you'd get 10 cents a kilowatt hour to run your hairdryer. But if you keep your hairdryer off, you're only going to get 3 cents for that excess electricity. And maybe it's not your hairdryer, maybe it's your clothes, your dryer, or your dishwasher, or some other load you can control. But point is, it actually encourages customers to use electricity exactly at the time when mostly we want them to not use so much electricity. And as people in the solar business can tell you, solar is an expensive business in terms of getting up to the roof. The customer acquisition, the engineering, the permitting, all that stuff is pretty expensive. Once you're on the roof, whether you do 4 or 5 kilowatts, it's a relatively small difference because a lot of the cost is up front. And by giving people relatively little money or less money for producing excess, they downsize their systems, which means we're wasting installers' time. We could have them up there getting 5 or 6 kilowatts with energy that would come in at peak periods to help the utility, but because of the way we price it, we induce them to just do 4 kilowatts because nobody wants to buy solar just to make excess electricity they only get 3 cents for. So it creates that then true-up periods. If you shorten the true-up period too much, like the monthly basis, you lose the benefit of carryover credit. And then the perverse effects with tiered rates. A lot of utilities are finally getting to the point where the more you use, the more you pay, which is the way it should be. But in a net metering world, the more you use, the higher the value of your solar. So energy hogs get the biggest value out of having solar. And while I do want big users to go to solar, I don't want them to have a price signal that says, use more electricity so you can get into a higher cost tier. And we use these tiers to try to encourage people to use less electricity. So it gets into a battle. So those were some of the things we had to address. If you go to the next slide, I'll tell you how we address them with our different approach. We did what I said before. We kind of went through this analysis of just trying to figure out what is this stuff worth. And we looked at it like a parfait glass. We said the very biggest part on the bottom of it is energy, right? And there's a value of energy. When that solar panel generates energy, it's making energy that I don't have to generate. That's worth something, usually pretty much the cost of fuel. But it's also avoiding capacity, which is the ability to have a power plant on. And solar tends to line up nicely with when the system needs the most energy. So that's really good. That's capacity. And it avoids transmission because it goes just from Phil's rooftop to his toaster, not from all the way out there. And it avoids distribution costs and transformer costs and wear and tear on those systems. And by the way, it avoids more because it generates on peak when the wear and tear on the systems is greater. And it avoids environmental costs, not just those that are reflected in the pollution control costs, but things like the future issue of controlling climate emissions and water related environmental costs, and especially if you're like in a drought state, you know, water rationing related costs and the ability to run power plants as efficiently. So there's a lot of benefit, and if we do those analytically, we can figure out what the value is. And that's what we went through. And by the way, 2 to 4 to 5 times more than those values that utilities typically look at are values associated with creating jobs, keeping money in the local economy, being more job intense than things like nuclear power plants. So when policymakers can get involved, they can consider those other benefits and say, wow, even at the indifference price, where we don't care if the utility does it versus whether Phil does it. Sorry, Phil, I'm going to just keep using you all night like this. But there, even if those two numbers are exactly equal, the solar stuff is a better deal. Because the guy that put that on his roof is here and lives here in the same community and pays taxes here and works in the community and, et cetera, shops at the stores and all those sorts of things. So there's even more value out there, which you don't necessarily have to put in rates, but tells us that we should try to tilt the table in the direction of Phil putting on a solar plant, if he can do it for that 12.5 cents or whatever that number is. Next slide. So here's a great slide from RMI. This just takes that concept of all those values and gives you a picture of it. It'll be in the slides they hand out because I'm never going to pay any royalty to RMI for using their slide. Sorry. I assume it was on the web. It must be free. But I credit them. I credit them. I cite them. It is RMI. And I just like it because it's a really, and wait till you see the next one. I like it because it shows you sort of it's that energy capacity, all those things I talked about, and more that I didn't talk about. So there's a lot of value in that kilowatt hour on Phil's roof, made on Phil's roof, and we should account for it. Next slide. It's also true that we need to take account of to whom. And this is a major part of the debate. The utilities seem pretty focused on value to me or cost to me. How does it affect my investment patterns, my returns, my profits? But really what we're talking about, and especially what we're talking about in a community that's talking about municipal electric utilities, is a bigger, broader societal view, right? We are talking about things like how does it affect the local economy? And how does it affect local air pollution and all those factors? How does it affect other customers? It's not just about Phil and the utility. It's about all of us. And we all get benefit if Phil helps the utility avoid building a transmission line somewhere down the line, one little piece at a time. We all get a benefit from that. And if 20 years from now, when gas prices are skyrocketing, Phil's flat-priced electricity is going to add a lot of value for all of us. So we ought to take in the broader perspective. Another graphic of theirs I like. Next slide. So what does it look like? Well, what we did is we just set up a bill design that says, we're going to charge you as if you didn't have solar, and then we're going to give you credit for everything you produced. We took the netting process that was happening on that metal disc and just put it on the bill. And we took that value of solar analysis and made it into a value of solar tariff. And there's a lot more detail to it, but we thought it would be kind of cool if customers would see a direct credit and that we would charge them for their energy services on the grid, and that it would be a fair deal and they would see it right there. And by making it explicit, the accountants get happy because they see the charge for consumption, and they get to put that on their books, collected it, just like we planned. And then they see a credit for the solar, which the resource planners get. Next slide. So what does it do? Well, one of the things that happened with this structure is that we completely eliminated the argument about cross subsidies because customers are responsible for their network charges even if they had solar, and we compensated them fairly. It keeps the utility whole, which as a utility guy was good. It reinstalls the incentive for efficiency. By going into a two-part rate structure where you see your charges and then you see your solar and you're charged for your consumption as if you had no solar, then you get a credit for all your solar at the full value of solar rate, whether it offsets your consumption or not, one solid rate, then what turns out is that you have a real strong incentive to say, hey, I'm going to save my consumption charge and reap the benefit of my solar generation credit. It doubles the financial incentive for efficiency. It prevents, we put in an annual adjustment mechanism to make sure we are always on time. We could do that because analysis allows you to do that, and we are doing it anyway. It fits with the idea of rank making the way utilities normally do it because it's based on all those analysis. By the way, all that analysis stuff, the point here is that utilities do this all the time anyway. They just haven't applied it to customer rates. So they don't have to learn many new skills. They just have to stop having the idea that they can't use those skills in other places. And it reduced the simple payback. It made solar more profitable for customers and allowed us in Austin to reduce our rebates by over 1/3 within a year with no diminution. Now they have over 2,500, heading up 3,000 solar systems. Rebates are down and customers are still buying. So the ecosystem is formed. Next slide. So I put this in the slide deck. What it really just shows you is where all these conversations go, as I've been talking about. PURPA way over there is the stingiest thing the utility can possibly give you. It costs so much to comply with some of the ways utilities do PURPA rules that it's probably worth negative to you. Net metering, if done poorly, is worth about half as much as value of solar. If done well, and it should be done well, gets you most of the way there, which is why I'm a real fan of good, strong net metering, even if you don't implement a value of solar rate. And the analysis will make the case for good, strong net metering. Some of these ideas that are out there, other ideas like buy-all, sell-alls, PPAs, FITs, they're more complicated transactions. I won't go into them. I'll just say buyer beware. Anything that puts the customer in a position of being a generator and seller of electricity from their rooftop comes with a lot of wrinkles. And if anybody puts you in that box, you may not like it. Commercial customers, you may be savvy enough to play with that. Homeowners, not so much. And out there, as that final reminder, there's still a lot more value in society that comes with this solar. Might not ever make it into rates, but we ought to keep thinking about it. All right, next slide. Last slide. So people ask a bunch of questions. I'll let you ask your own. But when you talk about sort of changing these ideas, these are some of the ones, you know, they're basically about, well, what about this, or what about that, or does it account for this, or does it account for that? And I can tell you that any new idea has flaws and is susceptible to improvements. Just between the time I developed the rate in Austin and the time we got it written into the law in Minnesota, several improvements were made. We're always learning, but we're supposed to be as human beings. And in most cases, there's an answer to some of these concerns. Was it RMI likes that Edwin Land quote, you know, sometimes to have a new idea, all you have to do is stop having an old idea, right? And what we did is we allowed ourselves the freedom in Austin to say we want to do solar, we want to do more solar, we want our customers to do more solar. How can we arrange the relationship? And in the end, that's the question you should be asking yourselves. Whether it's this or anything else, that's the question you need to answer in Boulder. You want solar? You want more solar? You want more customers to do solar? What relationship do you want to have? So thanks for your attention. I know I went on a bit long, but I probably pre-answered a few questions. So, who's got questions? So hit it one more time here. Avery, hit it one more.